Welcome back to another episode of Meat Sweats. Now today, it's always important to go back and brush up on some things that you may already know. Just because you learned something one time doesn't mean you can't learn it again. So the only way we're gonna get great at barbecue is through repetition, which is why today we're gonna go back to the basics and we're gonna go through everything you need to know on how to trim up your brisket. So let's get after it. Now, before we even trim this brisket, let's ask ourselves, why do we trim the brisket, right? Brisket, it's this massive chunk of meat, and it's pretty expensive these days. You're not really gonna come across many cheap briskets, so you're spending a lot of money on this. You go to your butcher, you pick up this whole packer brisket, maybe it comes in somewhere around 16, 17 pounds. You're thinking to yourself, like, why would I wanna trim like 5 pounds off of that brisket? Isn't that just gonna be a waste of money? It all comes down to the final product, right? You know, we're throwing this thing on the smoker for 12, 13, 14, 15 hours. You know, it depends on what temperature you're cooking at. It depends on what temperature it is outside. We're spending a lot of time though, and a lot of money on this brisket. So you wouldn't want to spend all that time and money on something that at the end, you just have this massive slab of, mutant meat that's just riddled with a bunch of unrendered fat. So the reason why we're trimming now at the first step of the process is so that at the very end, 15 hours later, the final product is much better. So you're gonna have nice, even slices. You're gonna have enough fat on there that it renders down, keeps that meat nice and moist, keeps it juicy, keeps it flavorful, but not to where you have to, just gnaw at a bunch of unrendered fat. It's just gonna help everything cook a little bit more evenly. So I know that it's gonna look like we're wasting a lot of this brisket. We're gonna be trimming a decent amount of it off, but at the end of the cook, when all is said and done, it's gonna make for a better product. When you're serving it to the people, when they see it, when they taste it, that's what they want, that's what they care about, and trimming the brisket now is gonna make that better. Now you can go to 100 different people and they're probably gonna have 100 different ways on how to trim your brisket. The way that I do it, I think it's pretty, pretty standard procedure. The first cut that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna come on this backside, and over here you're gonna see this big chunk of, and I gotta go to the gym. You're gonna see this big chunk of heel fat, right? So right here, we just have this big old piece of fat right here. It's thick, it's not gonna render down. We need to get this piece out of here. A lot of times, you might even be able to just kind of get in there with your finger, pull back and cut that out, but this time, just gonna go with the knife. And we're gonna get in here. We're gonna take out this heel fat. It might take, a couple different times through, but you see that right there. That's just all fat right there. No one's gonna enjoy eating this. What you can do is you can put it in sausage, you can put it in burgers, you can make beef tallow. You've heard the spiel already. Just keep this fat. You don't have to throw it out, but you don't want to eat it either. So might take, a couple good strokes to get that out of there. But just anything in here that you can kind of just pull away with, with your fingers, it's ready to come out anyway. All right, now that we have that heel fat out there, there's gonna be, a bunch of, some fat, some silver skin on the back side of the brisket. This is a part where, I say it's really up to you. You're gonna wanna take some of it off. Anything that looks, stringy, anything that like to your eye looks like shit, you'll probably want to get rid of that. But this point you can spend as much or as little time as you want to on the silver skin on the backside. It's not really going to affect the cook that much. It's just kind of what it means to you. What I will say is if you are going to be taking off the silver skin and all this fat on the backside, on the underneath of the brisket, one, have a good sharp knife on you. Two, with that good sharp knife, we're going to be cutting with the grain, so don't cut across the grain to get all this silver skin off. And also it works a whole lot better if the brisket is cold. You're going to be able to get through that a lot easier. If it's cold, it's not going to be slimy, sticky yet. So when you are trimming your brisket, I would recommend doing it right out of the refrigerator. So what I'm going to do is just kind of come up underneath, lift it up a little bit, and take off as much or as little of the sinew and silver skin as you want. All right, so once you have that bottom of the brisket as cleaned up as you want, now it's time to flip it over and we're gonna start working on this fat cap. Now the first thing that we are going to do on this fat side, this brisket, flip it over, and on the other side of that heel fat is going to be this massive hump. It's hump, mohawk, whatever you wanna call it. All right here, all this in here is just all fat that's not going to render. You gotta get it out of there. You can't just take a whole pack of brisket, season it up, throw it on the smoker without taking this fat out of there, because it's never gonna render. It's gonna end up terrible. No one's gonna wanna eat it. If you're serving it to your family, they're gonna say, hey, get the fuck out of my family. If you're serving it to people who you thought were your friends, guess what? You're not going to have friends anymore. If you're serving it to people who are paying for it, they're going to sue you. So you have to get rid of this fat. Now, some people might just come in and trim out this fat and leave the rest of this hump. What I'm going to do, and what most of the guys in Texas do, is they're just going to get rid of this whole hump, and it's going to feel like you're getting rid of a ton of meat. And I know it's going to hurt. I know it's going to feel like a son of a bitch when you get through this cut. It's going to feel like you just wasted so much money. But again, this goes into burgers, sausages, whatever. And getting rid of this now, it's going to make for a better product that's going to cook more evenly and make life easier on yourself. So just kind of have an understanding of how deep you want to go. And we're just going to come through and try to take most of this hump as much as we can with one fatal swoop. So, train's going by, but this is all in one take because we only have one hump. You can see just so much fat in there. Yes, are we losing a little bit of point meat? Absolutely. But if we took out that fat and just left that point meat on there, it's going to end up a little funky. It's not going to cook that well. It might end up a little too crispy. So, now we still have a little bit to clean up here. But as you can see already, a nice, even surface for this to cook evenly. All right, so kind of like that heel fat, you're not going to get all of it on the first cut. It would be nice if you did. That'd be great. You don't want to, have too many different cuts going on here, but it might take a few to get through the whole thing. One trick that I've learned about, cutting through that mohawk is as you're cutting, you kind of come in on an angle, and then you can kind of leave the tip of your knife kind of riding across the cutting board, and then that'll give you, that same angle to come all the way across. So, you want to feel that tip. You can kind of hear the tip going into the cutting board, and then you can kind of just keep coming all the way across. We're not done with that quite yet, but we're going to get around to the rest of that later. All right, so unfortunately, my phone decided to not record this next step. Not exactly sure what happened there, but I didn't catch it until it was too late. No big deal, because I'll just go back and I'll explain what I did right now, which was I turned that brisket around and I started working on the fat cap side opposite of the hump. First cut I made was right along the edge there. I'm not taking off too much, just kind of like a sliver. What exposing that edge is going to do, it's going to give you a better look of how much fat you still need to remove from that brisket. So, you're going to notice right where the point and the flat meet, there's going to be a little bit more fat in that area, and then it's going to start to sort of taper off as you get along to the flat. So, when you're trimming right there, you can start off by kind of cutting in to that fat a little bit, but as you get your stroke going, just make sure that you angle your knife up and kind of taper off along with that fat cap. That way you just don't end up scalping too much. Scalping's when you remove all the fat off the brisket and you expose the meat it's gonna inevitably happen a couple times as you're trimming a brisket. Personally, I think, a scalp here and there, not the worst thing in the world, just because it's going to give you a better idea of when and where you can stop trimming. But you don't want to scalp too much of your brisket, so you want to really make sure that you're focused on having your knife angled up as you're trimming. You can always take off more. You can't put back on the shit that you took off and scalped. So yeah, so you just make that cut along the edge. Understand how much fat you need to get off. We just want to make sure that we leave about 1/4 of an inch of fat cap still on that brisket. Round off those sides if you need to, and then we'll flip it back over to the hump side. All right, so once you're done on that side, what we're gonna do is just flip this over, and now we've got this side that had the hump. We're just gonna do the same thing where you make yourself a new edge on this side, just cutting straight down. You're not sacrificing a ton of meat, so it's no sweat off your back, no coin out of your wallet. So now you just expose how much of that fat cap is still to go. On this side of the brisket, the flat is always going to be thinner. So you can see we don't have a lot of meat under there. There's also not a lot of fat. So there's no more trim that we need to do on that side as far as the fat goes. Now we just have a good idea of how much more of this hump that we have to take off. And at this point, a lot of this is going to be with feel. So you're going to kind of want to push down on that hump fat. And if it feels soft, if it feels like your fingers are able to kind of push through it a little bit, then you're good to go. If it feels hard, if it feels like something that's not going to render, then you still have a little bit more trimming to do. So all right, so we've got the hump taken care of. We've got all the fat cap on that other side taken care of. Everything's kind of down to about 1/4 of an inch, nice and pillowy. Last thing that we are going to do before you just clean up the back here is we're going to come in and we're going to round off the front of the flat here. The reason for that being, when we put it on the smoker, we don't want any sharp edges. We don't want any corners like this, 90-degree corners, just because that's not going to help out with the airflow of the smoker, especially if you're using an offset cooker where that smoke is coming up and over the brisket. You want everything to be aerodynamic. So you want to round off those corners, and also on this side, the flat that's on the same side as the hump, again, like I mentioned, it's going to be a lot thinner. So what we can do here is kind of cut into that a little bit to where it gets thicker, and then kind of bring that over towards the other side of the flat that's going to be a little thicker. So we don't want anything where we have maybe like just over 1/4 of an inch of meat here. This part right here, it's going to get a little too crispy for me. When you're cutting it into slices, it's just going to kind of crumble apart. So we still want to get to the point of the flat that's a little bit thicker. So going to kind of come in, give yourself a little line to trace through. That way you have a good idea of what you want to do with this cut, so you're not just hacking at it blind. Round off that corner a little bit. And we're just going to round off this last corner. Okay, now you can see, so we have a little bit more meat that we can work with on that side of the flat. Then over here we still have a nice meaty part of the flat, but a little rounded off. That way it helps out with the airflow, and also make sure that we don't have any part of the flat that's just going to end up getting a little too crispy. Now what we can do is just kind of clean up anything that looks not so great along the back here. I would just kind of trim and just follow the shape of the brisket. Just get rid of anything that looks, if it looks like it's not going to be appetizing right now, chances are it's not going to be great once it's done cooking. So, just get rid of as much as you can. And that right there, everything you need to know on how to properly trim a brisket. Yeah, it might look like we took off a lot, but again, the final result, it's all going to be worth it. You can see already, nice even surface so that we're going to have a nice even cook, right? The flat and the point are going to be getting done around the same time. Makes it a whole lot easier on us, makes it better for the tenderness of the flat, makes it better for the tenderness of the point. You know, all that fat that's left in here now, it's going to render down, and it's going to add moisture, and it's going to add flavor. It's not going to be a pain in the ass when we end up slicing into it. You know, we didn't take too much off to where we have to worry about everything kind of flaking up, but we didn't take too little off to where, you know, you were going to be biting into massive hunks of unrendered fat. So that right there, everything you need to know. If you've trimmed your brisket properly, that's the most important step. That's step one right there, right? If you don't trim it properly, you can do everything else right. The brisket still might turn out to be, I'm not gonna say it's trash, right? Because, you know, you spend a lot of time on it. I don't wanna disrespect all the time that you put into it, but it's just not gonna be great. But you do it right at first, the whole rest of the cook gets that much easier. So tune in next time and we'll figure out how to cook this son of a bitch.